He wasn't scheduled to be there. The session was closed. No demonstrations, no observers, just routine training meant to stay internal. Bruce Lee entered without announcement and stood quietly at the edge of the room. 2 minutes later, the training stopped. Not because it was interrupted, but because it no longer made sense to continue the way it had been going. Nothing was corrected. Nothing was criticized. Yet when the session resumed, it followed a different logic than before. The training session followed a pattern everyone in the room recognized. It was closed, informal, and efficient. The kind of environment where instruction had already been agreed upon long before anyone stepped onto the floor. Movements were familiar. Sequences were repeated without hesitation. Corrections were minimal because the structure itself was trusted. This was not a place for experimentation. The drills emphasized control through consistency. Footwork followed prescribed lines. Strikes were delivered at measured angles. Partners moved in predictable cycles, each exchange reinforcing the idea that effectiveness came from refinement rather than reconsideration. No one questioned the process. The routines had produced results in the past. They were efficient, organized, and reliable. The room operated under the assumption that improvement meant sharpening what was already known, not disrupting it. Conversation was sparse. Instructions were given quietly and without emphasis. Corrections focused on alignment and timing within the existing framework. Everything served the rhythm of repetition, allowing practitioners to move without hesitation. The session was meant to remain internal. No observers, no demonstrations for display. This was work, not performance. The environment reflected that intention. The space was functional, not dramatic. Mats were worn. Equipment showed signs of regular use. Nothing about the room suggested spectacle or revelation. Those training were experienced. They moved with confidence, shaped by familiarity. Each motion had a purpose already assigned to it. Every response had been rehearsed enough times to feel instinctive. The structure held, at least it appeared to. What no one noticed yet was how dependent the session had become on assumption. The routines functioned smoothly because they did not resist scrutiny. They repeated patterns that had worked before, without asking whether those patterns still addressed the conditions they claimed to prepare for. This was not negligence. It was comfort. The kind of comfort that comes from reliability, from knowing what comes next, from trusting that structure itself is evidence of effectiveness. Within that comfort, subtle inefficiencies went unnoticed. Timing became approximate. Distance was measured by habit rather than awareness. Movements remained clean, but increasingly insulated from unpredictability. The session continued. No one was dissatisfied. No one was struggling, which was precisely why the routine felt complete. At this stage, there was no reason to change anything. The framework appeared intact. The training delivered exactly what it promised. And because it delivered consistently, it was rarely questioned. That was the condition Bruce Lee would walk into, without knowing the schedule, without intention to intervene, and without needing to disrupt anything deliberately. The routine did not fail on its own. It simply waited for something to reveal its limits. Bruce Lee did not announce himself. He entered the space the way someone might step into a room they were already familiar with, without urgency, without expectation of attention. The door closed quietly behind him, and for a moment, nothing changed. The session continued. Movements repeated their patterns. Footwork traced the same lines across the floor. Partners rotated through drills without interruption. The structure that defined the room did not bend to accommodate a new presence. At first, only a few noticed. A glance here. A pause half a beat longer than usual. Bruce Lee's arrival registered not as disruption, but as anomaly. Something unexpected, but not immediately relevant. He stood near the edge of the space, not central, not removed. He did not observe with intensity. There was no visible analysis, no scanning of technique or posture. He watched the way someone watches weather, attentive, but without the need to intervene. His expression remained neutral. His body relaxed. The instructors did not stop. There was no reason to. Bruce Lee had not been invited, but he had not intruded. His presence carried no demand. The session continued as planned, governed by the same assumptions that had shaped it from the beginning. Yet something subtle began to shift. It did not happen because Bruce Lee spoke or moved. It happened because he did neither. His stillness created contrast, not dramatic, but noticeable. Against the steady rhythm of repetition, his quiet attention stood apart. Some began to register the difference. Not consciously, not yet. It appeared as hesitation. A strike delivered a fraction slower. A step taken with slightly more care. Nothing overt enough to be corrected, but enough to change the tempo. Bruce Lee did not react. He did not meet anyone's eyes or adjust his posture to signal authority. He did not position himself as an evaluator. He remained exactly where he was, allowing the session to reveal itself fully. Those training continued to perform as they always had, but now performance felt different. Movements that once felt automatic began to feel rehearsed. Sequences that had flowed smoothly revealed small gaps. Moments where timing depended more on expectation than awareness. No one stopped. No one asked why. The instructors noticed the shift but did not name it. The drills remained the same. Corrections remained technical, yet room's confidence had softened, just enough to be felt. Bruce Lee understood this transition. He knew that presence alone could alter conditions. That observation, when unpressured, invited reconsideration. By not intervening, he allowed the routine to continue until its limits became visible from within. He was not there to expose flaws. He was there long enough for the training to encounter itself. The session carried on, still structured, still controlled. But beneath the repetition, awareness had begun to stir. Something in the room was no longer fully aligned with the certainty it had relied on moments earlier. The training had not been interrupted, but it was no longer untouched. And without a word being spoken, the presence at the edge of the room had begun to matter. Not because of who he was, but because of what he refused to do. The routine was still intact. For now, what followed would not arrive through instruction, but through attention. Quietly and without announcement. Bruce Lee remained where he was. He did not change position as the drills continued. He did not signal approval or concern. His presence did not introduce new instruction. It introduced awareness, the kind that settles gradually without demanding response. The first minute passed unnoticed. Movement stayed consistent. Partners completed their exchanges. The structure of the session held, supported by habit and familiarity. From the outside, nothing appeared to be changing. But inside the movement, something began to loosen. Practitioners started to feel the difference between executing technique and responding to conditions. A block arrived where it was supposed to, but not where it was needed. A strike landed cleanly, yet felt late. Timing that once felt precise now revealed itself as approximate. Bruce Lee did not react. He did not step forward to correct. He did not interrupt to explain. He allowed the drills to continue long enough for the friction to be felt internally, not pointed out externally. The second minute unfolded differently. Awareness sharpened. Some adjusted their spacing without instruction. Others slowed slightly, unconsciously compensating for uncertainty. The routines remained intact, but confidence no longer carried them effortlessly. This was not failure, it was exposure. The training had been built on repetition, and repetition had done its job. But repetition had also insulated the movements from unpredictability. What Bruce Lee's presence revealed, without saying so, was the gap between practicing a response and perceiving a situation. A few practitioners noticed it clearly. They felt moments where technique arrived before awareness, where movement filled space that no longer existed, where certainty replaced sensitivity. These realizations did not stop the drills, but they changed how the drills were experienced. Bruce Lee watched quietly. His attention did not fix on any individual. He observed the space between movements, the timing between decisions. He noticed when structure supported awareness and when it replaced it. The instructors sensed the shift, not as disruption, but as hesitation. The room's rhythm had slowed, not because of fatigue, but because attention had turned inward. The drills were still being performed, but now they were being felt. No one asked Bruce Lee what he thought. There was no invitation to comment, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. And yet, by the end of the second minute, it was clear to those present that the session was no longer operating on automatic confidence alone. Bruce Lee had not corrected a single movement. He had not offered a single alternative, Still, the training no longer felt complete. What emerged in those 2 minutes was not a new technique, but a question, unspoken but persistent. A question about whether repetition alone could prepare someone for conditions that did not repeat. The room had not been instructed to change. It had begun to notice, and that noticing carried weight. The drills continued, but with less force and more attention. Movements became smaller, more deliberate. Practitioners adjusted not because they were told to, but because they felt the need to. Bruce Lee remained silent. He did not claim the moment or define it. He allowed the awareness to surface on its own, unframed and therefore unresolved. The 2 minutes ended without signal, but the session had crossed a threshold. The routines were still there. The structure remained. Yet something essential had shifted, from executing what was known to sensing what was happening. And once that shift occurred, the training could not return to what it had been moments earlier. Not because it was wrong, but because the drills continued, but something had changed beneath them. What had once felt efficient now felt constrained. Movements still followed their prescribed paths, yet those paths began to feel arbitrary, chosen because they had always been chosen, not because they responded to what was actually unfolding. Practitioners noticed it without naming it. A strike landed cleanly, but the moment it arrived, it felt misplaced. A block met an incoming motion, yet resolved nothing. The exchange completed itself mechanically, but the purpose behind it felt delayed, almost disconnected. The problem was not execution, it was relevance. Bruce Lee did not intervene. He watched as the structure that had once carried the session began to resist itself. Techniques that relied on expectation now felt exposed. They worked when conditions cooperated, but when timing shifted slightly, when distance changed unexpectedly, their authority weakened. This realization did not arrive all at once. It surfaced as hesitation, a pause before committing to a sequence, a brief adjustment in foot placement. A strike pulled back mid-motion, not out of fear but out of doubt. The room's rhythm slowed, not because of fatigue, but because certainty had loosened its grip. The practitioners were no longer moving automatically. They were paying attention, and attention, unfiltered by habit, demanded time. Instructors noticed the change. They did not stop the session, but they stopped correcting in the same way. The usual cues, faster, sharper, more force, no longer felt appropriate. The structure they had trusted was still present, but its authority had weakened. Bruce Lee remained silent at the edge of the room. His presence did not apply pressure, it removed it. Without the need to perform or impress, the training began to reorganize itself around perception rather than repetition. Movements became smaller, not restrained but efficient. Less force was applied, not out of caution, but because excess no longer felt useful. Distance was adjusted instinctively, without instruction. Timing shifted from rehearsed beats to responsive moments. The session had not stopped, but it had stopped making sense in its old form. The realization was quiet and unsettling. It suggested that what had once felt complete was in fact conditional. That technique, when detached from awareness, became decoration rather than function. No one said this aloud. They did not need to. The feeling spread through the room without language, altering how each exchange was approached. People were no longer trying to execute perfectly. They were trying to remain present. Bruce Lee did not claim credit. He did not step forward to explain what was happening. He allowed the confusion to exist long enough for it to become productive. Because confusion, when unforced, creates space. And in that space, the training began to change. Not because it was instructed to, but because it could no longer proceed honestly in the same way. Movement had not failed, its assumptions had. And once those assumptions were exposed, the session was already moving toward something new, without yet knowing what to call it. It was no longer enough. No one called for a change. There was no signal from an instructor, no pause to redefine the session. Yet gradually the training adjusted itself, not through instruction, but through instinct. What had stopped making sense was quietly set aside, without discussion. Movements became simpler, not reduced, but refined. Practitioners stopped forcing sequences to completion when the moment no longer supported them. They allowed exchanges to end early or not begin at all. The emphasis shifted from executing form to maintaining awareness. This was not taught, it emerged. Footwork grew lighter. Distance was managed more carefully. Instead of committing fully to prearranged responses, people began to wait, briefly, attentively, until action was necessary. Timing replaced speed. Sensitivity replaced strength. Bruce Lee remained silent. He did not guide the shift or approve of it. He did not step into the space to demonstrate an alternative. By staying where he was, he allowed the room to discover the adjustment on its own. That independence mattered. Had the change come from instruction, it might have been resisted or misunderstood. But because it arose organically, it felt natural, almost inevitable. The practitioners were not abandoning what they knew. They were discarding what no longer served the moment. The instructors noticed. They did not intervene. They observed the shift with the same quiet attention Bruce Lee had shown earlier. Corrections became fewer, more selective. When offered, they focused less on form and more on responsiveness. The session's energy changed. There was less noise, less impact, less effort spent proving effectiveness. What replaced it was concentration, sustained, unforced, and grounded in what was actually happening between partners. No one named the change. To name it would have required certainty, and certainty was precisely what had dissolved. The training had entered a state where definition felt premature. Bruce Lee watched. He recognized the moment for what it was. Not a breakthrough, not a revelation, but a realignment. The training had moved closer to reality by shedding what it no longer needed. The 2 minutes had passed. What followed did not feel like continuation. It felt like something new unfolding quietly within the same space. The routines were still there, but they were no longer dominant. They served awareness rather than replacing it. Eventually, Bruce Lee shifted his weight slightly, not to draw attention, not to signal departure, just enough to indicate that his role, if it could be called that, was complete. The session continued without him stepping forward, and that was the point. What had changed did not belong to him. It belonged to the room, to the practitioners who had felt the gap between habit and reality and adjusted accordingly. The philosophy that emerged was not explained or announced, it was practiced. And because it was practiced before it was named, it carried a weight that theory alone could not provide. The training did not end, but Bruce Lee did not stay long after that. There was no formal conclusion to the session, no acknowledgement that something significant had occurred. He did not offer feedback, nor did he gather the group for discussion. When he left the edge of the room, it was without signal, as quietly as he had arrived. The training continued. At first, it did so cautiously, as if waiting for instruction that never came. But gradually, the session found its own rhythm again. Different from before, slower and more attentive. Movements were chosen more carefully. Exchanges ended when they needed to, not when a sequence demanded it. No one tried to restore the old routine. It wasn't rejected outright. It simply no longer fit as it once had. The structure remained available, but it was no longer trusted blindly. Practitioners began to test their movements against the moment rather than against expectation. In the days that followed, the shift persisted. Those who had been present noticed it during later sessions. Drills that once felt complete now felt preliminary. They were useful, but only as reference points, not destinations. Awareness had become central, and repetition served it rather than replacing it. People struggled to explain what had changed. Some described it as efficiency. Others spoke about adaptability. A few mentioned freedom. None of the words felt sufficient. The experience resisted summary because it had not arrived through explanation. Bruce Lee never revisited the moment. He did not cite it as an example or incorporate it into instruction. He did not claim responsibility for the shift. To him, the session had simply reached a point where it could no longer proceed honestly without adjustment. That restraint mattered. Because the change had not been named, it was not limited by definition. Because it had not been taught, it was not owned by anyone. It belonged to those who practiced it. Years later, when the session was recalled, it was not remembered as a lesson delivered by Bruce Lee. It was remembered as a moment when training began to feel closer to reality. Witnesses spoke less about what he did and more about what stopped happening. Excess movement, forced responses, the need to complete sequences regardless of conditions. What replaced those habits was subtle, a willingness to pause, an attention to timing, a respect for what the moment required rather than what routine demanded. The philosophy that emerged did not arrive fully formed. It developed quietly over time through continued practice. It shaped how people trained, how they approached conflict, and how they understood effectiveness. Not as something imposed, but as something that emerged when resistance was removed. Bruce Lee's role in that legacy was indirect. He did not introduce a system. He did not declare a new approach. He entered a room, observed honestly, and left without interference. And in those 2 minutes, without instruction or demonstration, the training encountered its own limits and moved beyond them. The session was never meant to be seen. Yet what it revealed endured, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Would never proceed in quite the same way again.